I never thought I'd be the kind of person who'd notice something as small as a lantern being left on, but there I was, lying in my sleeping bag in the darkness of our shared cabin, staring at the warm golden glow that Felix kept burning on the small table between our bunks. It was our third night at the wilderness retreat, and I'd started to realize that the lantern never went out until after I fell asleep. The retreat was supposed to be a reset for me. 26 years old, burned out from my job in tech, going through the motions of a life that felt increasingly hollow. My best friend Mara had practically forced me to sign up, insisting that 2 weeks disconnected from everything would do me good. No phones, no internet, just hiking and campfires and whatever personal growth happens when you're forced to be alone with your thoughts. I'd rolled my eyes at the brochure's promises of self-discovery, but I went anyway because the alternative was spending another month eating takeout alone in my apartment and wondering why nothing felt right anymore. I got assigned to cabin 7 with 3 other guys. There was Marcus, a loud investment banker who treated every conversation like a networking opportunity. There was Owen, quiet and forgettable, who spent most of his time reading thick fantasy novels. And then there was Felix. Felix had arrived at the cabin about an hour after the rest of us, hauling a worn backpack that looked like it had seen actual adventures, not just weekend camping trips. He was tall and lean, with dark curly hair that fell into his eyes and the kind of easy smile that made you want to smile back without knowing why. When he introduced himself, his handshake was warm and firm, and I noticed his eyes were this striking shade of green that seemed to catch the light. That first night, we'd all stayed up talking, the nervous energy of strangers trying to figure out how to coexist in close quarters. Marcus dominated the conversation as expected, Owen contributed the occasional comment, and I found myself more interested in watching Felix than talking. He had this way of listening that made whoever was speaking feel like they were the only person in the room. He'd lean forward slightly, nod at the right moments, ask thoughtful questions. When he laughed, it was genuine and unguarded, and something about it made my chest feel tight in a way I didn't quite understand yet. We'd all eventually settled into our bunks, and that's when I first noticed it. Felix had lit the old oil lantern that sat on the table, adjusting the flame to a soft glow. Marcus and Owen fell asleep quickly, their breathing evening out into the steady rhythm of sleep. But I've always been a restless sleeper, my mind racing through tomorrow's anxieties and yesterday's regrets. I lay there in the darkness, watching the shadows dance on the wooden ceiling, and I could feel Felix's presence in the bunk across from mine. I must have shifted, or sighed, or made some sound that gave away my wakefulness, because Felix's voice came softly through the darkness. "Are you still awake?" I turned my head to look at him, and in the lantern light I could see him propped up on one elbow, looking at me with concern. "Yeah," I admitted. "I don't sleep well in new places." He nodded like he understood. "Me neither, usually," he said. "But there's something about being out here that makes it easier. The quiet, maybe." We talked for a while that night, our voices low so we wouldn't wake the others. He told me he was a wildlife photographer, that he spent months at a time in remote locations, that he'd come to the retreat because even someone who loves solitude needs human connection sometimes. I told him about my job, about the feeling of being trapped in a life that looked good on paper but felt empty. I don't know why I opened up to him like that. I'm usually guarded with strangers, but something about the darkness and his gentle attention made it easy to be honest. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep, and when I woke up in the morning, the lantern was out. The second night, I paid more attention. We'd spent the day on a challenging hike, and I'd somehow ended up walking beside Felix for most of it. He pointed out things I would have missed, a hawk circling overhead, the track of a deer in the mud, the way the light filtered through the pine trees at a certain angle. He had this way of seeing beauty in everything, and I found myself seeing the world differently through his eyes. Marcus had charged ahead, determined to prove his fitness, while Owen lagged behind, content with his own pace. Felix and I fell into an easy rhythm, our steps matching, our conversation flowing naturally between comfortable silences and deeper exchanges. That night, after dinner and the communal campfire where everyone shared stories and sang off-key songs, we returned to our cabin. Marcus passed out almost immediately, snoring within minutes. Owen put in AirPods and closed his eyes, and Felix lit the lantern again, that same soft golden glow. I lay in my sleeping bag, pretending to settle in for sleep, but I was hyper-aware of everything. The way Felix moved around the cabin, putting away his things with quiet efficiency, the sound of him brushing his teeth outside, the creak of his bunk as he climbed in. And then, in the low light, I saw him pull out a small journal and begin to write, his hand moving steadily across the pages. I watched him through half-closed eyes, afraid he'd notice if I stared too openly. There was something mesmerizing about the concentration on his face, the way he'd pause sometimes and stare into the middle distance before continuing. I wondered what he was writing. I wondered if he wrote about his day, about the hike, about anything he'd noticed. I wondered if he'd written about me. That thought sent a strange flutter through my stomach, and I had to close my eyes and take a slow breath. What was I doing? I'd had crushes before, obviously. I'd dated a few women in college and after, relationships that fizzled out because something always felt slightly off, like I was playing a role rather than being myself. I'd had close male friends I admired, guys I wanted to be around all the time, but I'd never let myself examine those feelings too closely. It was easier to stay in the safe zone of plausible deniability, to tell myself I just really valued friendship. But lying there in the darkness, watching Felix write in his journal by lantern light, I couldn't deny what I was feeling. The flutter in my stomach when he smiled at me. The way I'd found excuses to walk beside him on the trail. The fact that I was now completely aware of every breath he took, every small movement he made. This wasn't just admiration or friendship. This was attraction, desire, maybe even the beginning of something deeper. The realization should have terrified me, but instead, it felt like something clicking into place. Like a door I'd kept locked, finally opening, letting light into a room I'd been too afraid to enter. I must have made some sound, or maybe Felix just sensed my restlessness again, because he looked up from his journal and our eyes met across the space between our bunks. "You okay?" he asked softly. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He studied me for a moment, and I wondered what he saw in my face. Then he smiled, this gentle, understanding smile, and went back to his writing. I watched the lantern flicker and glow, casting Felix's shadow large against the cabin wall. My heart was beating harder than it should have been, and I felt simultaneously terrified and exhilarated. I was 26 years old, and just now understanding something fundamental about myself. Something I'd been avoiding or denying or just not ready to face. Eventually, my eyelids grew heavy, and I felt myself drifting towards sleep. Just before I went under, I heard the soft sound of Felix closing his journal, the rustle of him settling into his sleeping bag. And the lantern stayed on, that warm, protective glow, until I finally let go and slipped into dreams. The pattern continued. Every night, Felix would light the lantern, and every night it would stay burning until after I fell asleep. On the third night, I finally asked him about it. We were alone in the cabin, Marcus and Owen having stayed at the campfire for some drinking game. Felix was organizing his photography equipment, and I was sitting on my bunk trying to work up the courage to speak. "Why do you keep the lantern on?" I asked, my voice coming out more uncertain than I intended. Felix looked up, and in the evening light coming through the cabin window, his eyes were impossibly green. He seemed to consider the question carefully, like he was deciding how honest to be. "You seem like you have trouble falling asleep," he said finally. I thought maybe the light helps. Makes it feel less lonely or something. He shrugged, but there was a vulnerability in his expression that made my breath catch. I do the same thing at home. I can't sleep in complete darkness. It feels too much like being nowhere. It was such a simple explanation, but the fact that he'd noticed my restlessness, that he'd thought about what might help, that he'd done this small kindness every night without saying anything, it made my chest ache with something I couldn't quite name. "Thank you," I said quietly. "It does help." We looked at each other for a long moment, and something passed between us. Some understanding or acknowledgement that felt significant even if I couldn't articulate what it meant. Felix smiled, and I smiled back, and the air in the cabin felt charged with possibility. That night we talked longer than usual. Felix told me about his childhood, growing up in a small town where being different meant being isolated. He didn't say explicitly what kind of different, but I heard it in the spaces between his words, the careful way he chose his phrases. I told him about my own experience of always feeling slightly disconnected, like I was watching my life from the outside rather than living it, like I was waiting for something to start, but I didn't know what. "Have you ever felt like you were hiding from yourself?" I asked him, the question coming out before I could second-guess it. The lantern flickered between us, and Felix's expression turned thoughtful. "Yeah," he said softly, "for a long time. But at some point, hiding becomes more exhausting than just being honest, even if being honest is scary." He paused, then added, "Especially when it's being honest with yourself." I knew he was talking about more than just general self-awareness. I knew in that moment that Felix understood exactly what I was going through because he'd been through it himself. The knowledge settled over me like a blanket, comforting and terrifying at once. We fell asleep that night with the lantern burning between us, and I dreamed of green eyes and warm light and the feeling of finally coming home. The days blurred together in the best way. Felix and I became inseparable, though we never discussed it or made it official. We just naturally gravitated toward each other. We'd hike together, sit together at meals, find each other by the campfire. Marcus made a few jokes about us being joined at the hip, and Owen observed us with quiet interest but said nothing. I didn't care what they thought. For the first time in my life, I was letting myself feel something fully, without analysis or denial. I learned Felix's habits and quirks, the way he always woke up before dawn to photograph the sunrise, the way he hummed under his breath when he was content, the way he listened to people, really listened, like their words mattered. I learned that he took his coffee black, that he had a scar on his left hand from a childhood accident involving a fishing hook, that he'd been in love once before and it had ended badly, leaving him cautious about opening up again. I told him things I'd never told anyone, about the loneliness I'd felt even in relationships, about the way I'd sometimes catch myself staring at guys and have to force my eyes away, about the fear that I'd wasted my 20s being someone I wasn't. Felix listened to all of it without judgment, without trying to fix anything, just present and understanding. One afternoon, we hiked to a secluded lake, just the two of us. The water was impossibly clear, reflecting the surrounding mountains like a mirror. We sat on the rocky shore, our shoulders almost touching, and Felix pulled out his camera to take photos. I watched him work, fascinated by his focus and the way he framed each shot. He caught me watching and smiled. "Want to see?" he asked, holding out the camera. I took it, scrolling through the images. They were beautiful, capturing the play of light on water, the texture of the rocks, the sweep of the landscape. And then I came to a photo that made my heart stop. It was me, from earlier in the hike, looking out over a valley. The sunlight was in my hair, and my expression was open and peaceful. I looked happy in a way I didn't recognize, like I was finally comfortable in my own skin. "You took this?" I asked, my voice rough. Felix nodded, and when I looked at him, there was something in his eyes that made it hard to breathe. "You looked like you belonged there," he said quietly, "like you'd found something you'd been looking for." I handed back the camera. our fingers brushing in the exchange, and neither of us pulled away. We sat there with our hands touching this small point of contact that felt enormous. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure he could hear it. I wanted to say something, to acknowledge what was happening between us, but I didn't have the words yet. Felix's thumb moved slightly against my hand, a gentle caress, and I turned to look at him. He was already looking at me, and the expression on his face was tender and uncertain and hopeful all at once. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and his fingers laced through mine. We sat like that for a long time, holding hands by the lake, not talking, just being together. It was the most intimate moment of my life, more meaningful than any kiss or anything more I'd experienced before. It was the moment I stopped hiding from myself, stopped pretending I didn't feel what I felt. It was the moment I chose honesty over fear. That night, the lantern ritual took on new meaning. Felix lit it as usual, but now there was an acknowledgement between us, an understanding that it wasn't just about helping me sleep. It was about connection, about one person seeing another's need and meeting it, about small acts of care that add up to something bigger. We lay in our bunks, and I could feel the weight of everything unspoken hanging in the air. Marcus was snoring, Owen was already asleep, and it was just Felix and me in the golden glow of the lantern. I wanted to climb out of my sleeping bag and cross the space between us. I wanted to know what it would feel like to be held by him, to fall asleep with his arms around me. But I was still learning how to be brave, still finding my footing in this new understanding of myself. "Felix," I said quietly. "Yeah?" he answered. "I'm glad you were assigned to this cabin. I'm glad I met you." There was a pause, and then his voice came back, warm and certain. "Me too, Dylan. Me too." I fell asleep that night feeling less alone than I ever had in my life, the lantern burning steady and true. The retreat was supposed to last 2 weeks, but by the end of the first week I was already dreading its conclusion. What happened when we left this bubble? When we went back to our regular lives, to jobs and responsibilities in the real world? Would this connection survive, or was it just a product of the isolated environment, the forced proximity? I tried not to think about it, to stay present in each moment, but anxiety has always been my constant companion. Felix seemed to sense my growing tension. One evening, after everyone else had gone to bed, he suggested we go for a walk. We grabbed flashlights and slipped out of the cabin, walking along the trail that led deeper into the woods. The night was clear, the stars brilliant in the unpolluted sky. We walked in comfortable silence for a while, our flashlights creating small pools of light on the path ahead. Finally, Felix stopped at a clearing where we could see the sky unobstructed. He turned off his flashlight and gestured for me to do the same. In the sudden darkness, the stars were overwhelming, more than I'd ever seen in my life. "Look," Felix said, pointing up. "That's Cassiopeia, and there's Orion." He guided me through the constellations, his voice soft and patient, and I stood there trying to focus on the stars, but mostly just aware of how close he was standing, how I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Dylan," he said, and the way he said my name made me turn to face him. I can't see you clearly in the darkness, but I could feel his attention focused entirely on me. "I know you're worried about what happens after this. I am too, but I don't want that worry to stop me from being honest about what I'm feeling." My heart was racing. "What are you feeling?" I asked, my voice barely steady. He took a breath, and I could hear the nervousness in it. "I'm feeling like I've been waiting my whole life to meet someone who sees me the way you do, someone who makes me want to be brave. I'm feeling like maybe I'm falling in love with you, and that terrifies me, but not as much as the thought of not telling you." The world seemed to stop spinning. Everything I'd been too afraid to acknowledge, too uncertain to voice, was suddenly laid bare between us. "I'm falling in love with you too," I said, and saying it out loud felt like jumping off a cliff. exhilarating and terrifying. I don't know what I'm doing. I've never done this before. But I know that when I'm with you, I feel like myself for the first time. "Can I kiss you?" Felix asked, and I barely got out a yes before his lips were on mine. It was gentle at first, tentative, both of us learning the shape of each other. Then it deepened, and I felt something in my chest crack open, years of denial and fear and loneliness pouring out to be replaced by this overwhelming feeling of rightness. His hands cupped my face, and I gripped his shoulders, and we kissed under the stars like we were the only two people in the world. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathing hard, and I could see the shine of his eyes in the starlight. That was, I started, but I didn't have words for what it was. "Perfect," Felix finished, and I nodded. "Yeah, perfect." We walked back to the cabin, holding hands, and when we slipped inside, Marcus and Owen still sleeping, Felix lit the lantern as always. But this time, after he climbed into his bunk, he reached his hand across the space between us. I reached back, and we fell asleep like that. Fingers intertwined, the lantern burning until our breathing synced and we drifted off together. The second week of the retreat passed in a blur of happiness I'd never experienced before. Felix and I were openly together now, not hiding our affection, though we kept it appropriate given the shared cabin situation. Marcus made a few awkward comments at first, but eventually accepted it with a shrug. Owen, surprisingly, told me one day that he'd known from the first night, that it was obvious in the way we looked at each other. "Was it that obvious?" I asked, embarrassed. He smiled. "Only to someone paying attention. You both looked like you'd been waiting your whole lives to find each other." Felix and I talked about the future, making plans that felt both thrilling and scary. He lived 3 hours away from me, but we agreed that was manageable. We'd make it work. We'd visit on weekends, take turns driving, figure it out as we went. What mattered was that we were choosing this, choosing each other, choosing to be brave. On our last night at the retreat, there was a final campfire where everyone shared what they were taking away from the experience. When it was my turn, I looked at Felix sitting across from me, the firelight dancing on his face, and I knew exactly what to say. "I came here thinking I needed to find myself," I said. "But what I actually needed was to stop hiding from myself. I needed to be honest about who I am and what I want, and I needed to meet someone who made me want to be that honest." Felix's eyes met mine across the fire, and the smile he gave me was worth every moment of fear and uncertainty I'd ever felt. That last night in the cabin, Felix lit the lantern one final time. We lay in our bunks, both of us awake, neither wanting to sleep and miss our last hours in this place that had changed everything. We talked about small things, big things, everything and nothing. We made promises about staying in touch, about making this work, about not letting the real world dim what we'd found here. As my eyes finally grew heavy, I looked across at Felix one more time. "Thank you," I said, "for leaving the lantern on, for seeing me, for everything." He smiled, and even in my drowsy state, I could see the love in his expression. "It was never just about the lantern," he said softly. "It was about making sure you knew someone was there with you in the dark." I fell asleep that night knowing I'd found something rare and precious. Not just love, though it was definitely that, but also the courage to be myself, to stop hiding, to step into a life that actually felt like mine. And when I woke up in the morning, the lantern was out, but Felix was already awake, watching me with those green eyes, and I knew that even without the light, I'd never feel alone in the darkness again. We left the retreat that day, exchanging numbers and making plans for the following weekend. Marcus and Owen said their goodbyes, wishing us well with varying degrees of enthusiasm. As Felix and I stood by our cars, neither of us wanting to be the first to leave, he pulled me into a tight hug. "This isn't the end," he whispered against my ear. "This is just the beginning." He was right. 3 months later, we're still together, still navigating the distance and the challenges, but doing it together. Felix has a drawer at my apartment now, and I keep a toothbrush at his place. We've met each other's friends, started blending our lives in small but significant ways, and every night when I'm at his place, or when he stays at mine, he lights a small lamp on the nightstand and leaves it burning until I fall asleep. Some people might think it's silly, this ritual we've maintained, but to me, it's a reminder of where we started, of the moment I stopped hiding and started living. It's a symbol of care and attention, of someone noticing what you need and providing it without being asked. It's love in its simplest, most profound form. I never expected to find myself at a wilderness retreat. I never expected to share a cabin with someone who would change my life. I never expected to fall in love with a man who photographs wildlife and writes in journals and understands the importance of light in the darkness. But that's the thing about life, I've learned. The most important things are usually the ones you never see coming. And now, every night as I drift off to sleep with that warm glow beside me, I think about that first night in the cabin, when I noticed Felix leaving the lantern burning. I didn't understand it then, didn't understand what it meant or what it would lead to, but now I know. It was his way of saying, I see you, I'm here with you, you're not alone. And that simple act of kindness opened the door to everything that came after. Sometimes love announces itself with grand gestures and dramatic declarations, but sometimes it's quieter than that. Sometimes it's just a lantern left burning in the darkness, a hand reaching across the space between bunks, a gentle voice asking if you're okay. Sometimes love is just someone noticing what you need and caring enough to provide it, night after night, until you finally feel safe enough to fall asleep. That's what Felix gave me. Not just love, though there's plenty of that, but safety, acceptance, the freedom to be myself without fear or shame. And in return, I've given him the same. We're learning together, growing together, building something real and lasting from that foundation of honesty and care we established in a rustic cabin in the woods. The lantern still burns every night, and I still fall asleep feeling grateful for the man who saw me struggling in the darkness and decided to bring light. That's love, I think. Not the fireworks and passion of movies, though we have that too, but the steady, reliable presence of someone who stays with you through the dark hours, who keeps the light burning until you feel safe enough to rest. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who'd notice something as small as a lantern being left on, but I did notice, and it changed everything.